Good morning, everyone. So I will be presenting this work on behalf of the following researchers, please, and would like to properly acknowledge them. So they are Dr. Richard Terchani, Program Director at the Central European Institute of Asian Studies, and key researcher at Pulaski University Olomouc. Dr. Jan Daniel, Head of the Center of the Study of Global Regions at the Institute of International Relations, Prague. And Dr. Wojciech Bachensky, Associate Fellow at the Institute of International Relations, Prague, researcher at the Faculty of Social Science of Charles University, and an analyst at the Association for International Affairs. So here are the contents of today's talk that I'll be going through, and I'll jump right into the motivation for this work. So, Russian and also increasingly Chinese information operations have in recent years been in the forefront of threat assessments by NATO countries. So concerns about China's power in particular and the challenge of the existing Western-led international order, together with its attempts to increase its information influence in this area, makes Chinese efforts in the information space and domain a strategic and security issue. So while the limited cooperation between China and Russia and the distancing comments that China especially has made with regard to since the onset of the Russian war in Ukraine, might question this friendship with no limits that had been declared just before the war between the two. These questions brings into question the nature as well as implications of such a friendship in the information domain, and the motivation is that this has been understudied. As such, so the aims of this work are threefold. Firstly, in response to this challenge, we would like to characterize both the Russian and Chinese information operations, particularly in NATO countries, focusing on their goals, content, as well as methods. The second is to explore synergies between the convergence of these two information operations between Russia and China, if any. So the third goal is to suggest measures and aimed at how to effectively counter these activities between the two. So in terms of methodology, the first part would be to create a literature review of existing Chinese and Russian information operations in a qualitative and anecdotal way. The second would be to formulate a framework to actually analyze whether or not there are such convergences that might be occurring in the content of the information operations being pushed to the target audiences, especially within NATO countries. So the third would be to look at the public opinion polls or quantitative data to support what was mentioned qualitatively and anecdotally, to look at what the public opinion in 10 NATO countries, as well as hopefully soon to be Finland and Sweden, and what they think about Russia and China in the information space. And some of these results might be surprising. Right, so the first thing that we would look at is the creation of a convergence network in order to look at whether or not there are convergence between the two information operations over here. So from here, we can actually see that there are two axes in terms of this analytical framework that's been done. And one thing that we would like to actually state is that observing similarities between Russian and Chinese information operations might actually be easily taken as a sign of their cooperation. Both are autocratic regimes. In many respects, they share enmity towards Western dominance in international relations. Both seek to expand their relationships, but however, if we were to assume that there's cooperation as a cause of this observed convergence, this could be a mistake with negative implications for policy making towards the two adversaries in general. And we need to specify what kind of countermeasures to their convergence in particular information on this could lead to. Therefore, it is clearly important to articulate an analytical network based on two analytical dimensions that we are actually look at. The first dimension that we are to see here is looking at domains of convergence in the areas of methods, content, and goals between the two information operations. The second draws inspiration from existing literature on policy diffusion, as well as military innovation diffusion, suggesting a topology distinguishing between true non-exclusive processes of cooperation, passive learning, and hostile learning. So if we were to go into the three areas of convergence for the horizontal layer, we can see that the first potential area of convergence between both info operations between two different countries could be that of methods. So specifically, what can be described as tactics of the operations? They respond to a number of questions that might be asked regarding particular national efforts in information operations, like what channels are used, what cognitive techniques do operations utilize to influence the target audiences, what means or procedures are employed to conceal the originator or the purpose of the info operations as well. The second area of convergence could be on the content, which the information operation pushes out, while the third would be convergence in the goals for the respective influence efforts. So it is well understood that particular information efforts might have aims beyond the goals of just spreading particular narratives or trying to muddle up the information space in this case. So for example, the most possibly common invoked strategies and aims of this information would be to undermine the cohesion of target societies, lowering trust in the public institutes and in the media of their target countries, or subverting national processes such as elections or referendums. So going into the vertical layer, we move on to the three processes of potential convergence. So these are differentiated mainly based on the level of participation by the respective actors for convergence. So first, cooperation. Cooperation between actors is the most obvious route between two countries where convergence can be observed. So in this case, the actors perceive it as their interest to come out conscientiously to cooperate. And this would be the most obvious form of looking at the process of convergence, which is cooperation, outright cooperation. So it can also be said that it's important to look at other cooperations whereby it's one-sided in nature. So where one side decides to align itself with another country, goals or messages, without the explicit sort of like consent required in a two-sided cooperation from the other side, just because it fits the needs and the interests of that side at that point in time. So this brings us to the second process of passive learning. So passive learning, it's just to the area whereby one person, one actor actually passively learns from the operations, from the data that is most of the time publicly available, that is publicly available and presented by the other side. So this would be a passively learning of one side from the other in the instance of info operations. So for example, should China actually seek to disrupt domestic policies or society in the US? So existing Russian information operations against the US, which there is actually a wealth of research on, discussing their forms, their efficacy, would be provide ample information and materials for the Chinese in order to do this, and to follow these tactics carefully and successfully. So this would be a form of passive learning, for example. The last process would be hostile learning, whereby convergence occurs, and this is equivalent to poaching, as well as industrial espionage, where the learning actor seeks to acquire expertise and proprietary knowledge from the other party, but in a hostile manner. So in the context that we are looking at Russian or Chinese information operations, hostile learning is thus theoretically rather unlikely in the domain of their goals, but could happen in the area of methods. So now that we have established this framework, let us look at the context of Sino-Russian relations next. It is useful to review the broader context of this bilateral relation between China and Russia, which highlights actually that the fact that these two countries historically are not natural friends, and they have actually faced each other historically a few times as enemies. So Sino-Russian relations goes back centuries and carry with them substantial baggage. Russia was in fact one of the European powers that participated in what is known today in China as the Century of Humiliation. In fact, China actually lost substantial parts of its historical territory to Russia. So one of the things that they seem to be in agreement on is that they both perceive a West that is in decline. Although in the 90s and 2000s, there was an improvement in ties that was observed, mainly where, economically speaking, China became a useful market for Russian products, such as energy resources, Russian industrial production, and perhaps more importantly, for weapons. However, the invasion of Ukraine by Russia could be a game changer for Sino-Russian relations, especially if this conflict were to drag on. And this is because China has not fully aligned itself with Russia and is trying to balance between preserving working relationships between the two with the West especially, and not explicitly endorsing Russian aggression in this sense. Number two, there is a growing power asymmetry between China and Russia, especially as the war drags on, and this has further accelerated since the start of the war, making Russia even more dependent on China. Thirdly, the growing instability within Russia itself is an issue which would arguably be one potential outcome of the invasion. And an unstable Russia is not in China's interests, as China has long been obsessed with security and stability, especially around its borders. So having a heavily nuclear-armed neighbor in internal turmoil, it's not compatible with Chinese strategic goals. So lastly, the shock waves of the Russians' full-scale invasion of Ukraine has been felt in other regions and impacted China's own foreign policy goals, like in Central Asia. So we see here a non-alignment of goals between the two countries. The countries might be more willing to hedge towards China, who has already made it clear it would protect the sovereignty and territorial integrity of these countries. With this context laid out between Russia and China relations, we can now go into a discussion of Russian and Chinese information capabilities and an analysis of potential convergence between the two. So we know that the contemporary form of Russian information operations in the West are a result of recent changes in international media and information environment and the availability of new means of communications within the last few decades. So Russia has been paying attention to the information security and the perceived superiority of Western states in the information sphere since 2000s. However, it is notable that it has increased its assertiveness in this sphere in the second half of the last decade as well. So what are the Russian goals in this sense over here? So the overall goals of the Russian information campaign would be to follows the major strategic directions of their foreign and security policy. They stem from the Russian self-perception as one of the main global superpowers. And it's constantly engaged in a competition of value and interest between the West. So the goals of Russian information campaign can thus be segmented into 4 types, justifying their behavior on the international stage. Promoting pro-Russian actors in target societies with an important goal of weakening EU and NATO common positions on Russia. So kind of like create instability within the membership. Sow discord within the target societies and cause social strife. As well as also we see them shielding or trying to shield Russia from the controversies and creating narratives to shield Russia from these narratives that are out there, from particularly, for example, this invasion. On tactics, Russia has a whole spectrum of tools developed. So on the official end, we know that Russia uses its official communications platforms such as statements from ministries, Kremlin representatives of armed forces, and diplomatic missions over here. They also rely heavily on their social media account to reach a wider audience domestically as well as internationally. But on the less official end, Russia also utilizes its cultural institutes and other government-funded organizations to promote their own narratives among its populations and the population of target countries. The media organizations attached to the establishment of the Russian state are next on the spectrum, or semi-official tactics over here. So besides state-funded networks and media networks, the Russian state also has strong connections with several video and digital content producers. For example, Rupli, which is a direct subsidiary of RT. So on the more informal and more completely covert tactics that Russia employs, they are also able to target the Western and other audiences using a wide range of proxies or ideologically affiliated medias, as well as a network of fake social media accounts, fake websites posing as legitimate news, or sometimes even big media portals like Guardians or the New York Times, as well as the use of trolls and hackers. So in contrast, looking at the goals of the Chinese information operations, the single most important strategic goal of the Chinese Communist Party is regime security. No other country in the world has been so obsessed about its international image. This has led China to heavily invest in how the world actually perceives it and its international image. Thus, China's goals in the information operations realm follows this to create a favorable information environment about itself, to hold a general positive view of China, to engage China economically, and in a sense to try to make sure that others do not oppose it, if not, do not openly, do not oppose China, if not openly supporting it, based on sensitive political issues, such as territorial disputes, human rights, and other issues which we'll go slightly into detail later. So for China, besides the discontent of the US and the West, they have been quite active in offering positive visions of itself to the world, primarily focusing on developing countries, like the Belt and Road Initiative. So China has also been promoting this positive image to Europe and other countries of the global south. One of China's goals has long been to support the EU's concept of strategic autonomy, which China perceives as making Europe more independent from the US. Since NATO is a consensus-driven alliance, one way of weakening its ability to act as a unified actor is to establish friendly relations with some of its members and persuade them to take China's positions on some of these issues, or as mentioned, at least not to take the anti-Chinese stance promoted by the US on these issues. So for China's tactics in the information space, perhaps no other country as well has invested so heavily in public diplomacy and general info ops. So the basis of their information architecture consists of official channels, which include diplomacy and state media, both which has grown to the extent that they are some of the most extensive in the world. In terms of media infrastructure, China has built up also a wide and deep network involving official press agencies, newspapers, TVs, radio stations to cover main media channels. Xinhua News Agency has over 180 news bureaus globally in 8 different languages, for example. For non-official state actors, this leads actually to a situation here whereby readers, listeners, and watchers of like TV news channels sometimes do not immediately, and sometimes not at all, they do not recognize that the content that they are consuming are not produced by the given media, but instead sometimes come from China. So this is one of the tactics that they have employed. Chinese media have been successful because in recent years to get their content into many international media sources, either as paid advertisements, content sharing agreements in countries, just to list a few: Greece, Italy, Poland, Bulgaria, Albania, lots of countries. A similar effect can be achieved by relying on foreign friends of China who would promote the Chinese narratives, either as a part of their own initiative or by being offered material incentives by China. So there has been a growth of bot-like or inauthentic looking accounts for amplification tactics as well. Yep. So having established this, we now move on to the content of their operations. So to touch on this briefly, Russia information operation content unsurprisingly promote pro-Russian views on this particular area. They also support fringe political players whose agenda fits with Russians' position on the issues and denigrate their opponents. They like to point out the Western hypocrisy and double standards that they claim, and engage in criticism of main political forces and many of their failings. So for example, during the Black Lives Matter protests in the US, Russian channels such as Redfish and other affiliated channels highlight systemic racism and the anti-police angle that it's used to drive a wedge within society, between different factions of society. China, on the other hand, one of the main contents would be to look at Chinese traditional culture, its economic improvements, especially in the last few decades, and its need to present itself as a responsible and pacifist great power that is looking to contribute to the well-being of everyone in the world, particularly to those in the global south who have struggled against Western colonialism and imperialism. So this has started to change in recent years with growing tension between US and the other countries. So issues like Hong Kong's self-rule, the escalating human rights violation in Xinjiang and elsewhere in China, as well as the growing tensions across or in the Taiwan Straits. This has prompted Chinese actors to adapt more active and often confrontational attitudes, especially towards China and its allies. So in effect, the content of China's information operations now involves both positive messaging of China and negative messaging about the US. This shift has become even more fully visible after the beginning of the COVID-19 pandemic. So China, a generally restrained approach, although a growing confrontational attitude as well. So since we are on the topic of COVID-19, let's use this as an example of how Sino-Russian info ops were conducted during COVID-19. So during COVID-19, on the Russian information operations against NATO states, they have generally sought to achieve two main goals. First, to positively promote Russian achievements in fighting the virus, and to sow public discord in the target countries. So for example, the narratives at the early part of the pandemic was how Russians tried to portray themselves in positive light, while simultaneously criticizing the Western governments and institutions. So they portrayed Russia as a helping hand that supports countries struggling with the pandemic by providing supplies of medical resources as well as other forms of help. Importantly, it contrasted itself with the supposed lack of help from the EU and the US side, especially at the site of the pandemic, and highlighting what they see as the Western hypocrisy and lack of actual unity between the countries as well as lack of solidarity. So similarly, in the later stage of the pandemic, Russia lauded its own Sputnik V vaccine while spreading disinformation about Western-made vaccines and the supposed conspiracy between the West and their pharmaceutical companies. So Russian information operations are engaged in more straightforward disruptive content, targeting NATO and member countries without necessarily promoting Russia as a positive alternative as well. So these narratives include disinformation and conspiracy theories regarding the connection between the pandemic and 5G networks, as well as disinformation among the public health measures and the vaccination campaigns in the West. Excuse me. So on China, the features of these narratives are how they have provided aid as well as helping hand to countries, especially at the start of the pandemic. This is termed as China's vaccine diplomacy, whereby it used this to create goodwill for itself, while claiming that the zero COVID model that they have since abandoned has been superior to the rest of the world, and specifically to the West and their strategies. So, but also importantly, COVID-19 has seen Chinese diplomats spreading conspiracy theories about the origin of the virus, supposedly coming from the US biolab and being brought to Wuhan by the US military. On Russian narratives with respect to their invasion to Ukraine. While the major strategic goals of Russian information operations in the form of shaping more positive images of Russia and the disruption of European societies stayed in principle similar during their invasion, the specific tactics and contents have shifted rapidly, as mentioned in the previous talk as well. So as the Russian state media was banned in the EU as well as some NATO countries, and social media networks acted against fake accounts, rapidly shutting them down, the Russian tactics gradually evolved during the conflict. So beyond using diplomats and other state actors, as well as their social media presence to reach foreign audiences, to cope with some of the bans, they started to focus on what are their remaining available social media channels, and often in languages other than in English. So they also gradually enhanced their info operations using bots, trolls, and technologies, as well as other COVID means. So including networks of journalists, bloggers acting without formal affiliation to Russia. So these tactics are often purely disruptive in nature, sharing false stories about refugees and other domestic grievances. So from here, what we can see correspondingly for China. Overall, during this invasion, China has been trying to present itself as a peaceful country, while blaming the US as the main culprit for Russia's preemptive invasion of Ukraine. Interestingly, while NATO is presented as an extending hand of the US, the EU is mainly painted as a victim, of US imperialism and an actor that needs to free itself from the US in China's info operations. So what can be gleaned from this? So over here, we have summarized the possible convergence and synergy between the two powers, which is delegitimizing the US, would be one narrative that's shared between both. So there are some evidence that China might be pursuing similar aims as covert operations similar to the Chinese, but it's still too early to reach a definitive conclusion given the limited evidence. So the Chinese info operations also focus on topics deemed important to China instead, like the Hong Kong, Taiwan, South China Sea, and Tibet and Xinjiang. Russia, on the other hand, employs narratives more instrumental to sow confusion and create confusion. So, to summarize, there seems to be no clear coordination based on anecdotal and qualitative research that has been done in this work, but rather it's an opportunistic in nature. So next, we would like to go through, since we have already gone through the qualitative and anecdotal part of the research, we'll look at some of the quantitative research that the authors have actually done. So the data used in this section originated from August and September 2020 and represents public opinion survey done in 10 NATO countries, plus Finland and Sweden. So on the question of how positively or negatively do you feel about the following countries, the results show that the NATO public in the survey states mostly viewed, unsurprisingly, Russia more negatively and the US more positively, while China is mostly in between or somewhere generally more negatively. Indeed, the order of attitudes between three countries is presented. These three countries is present in all but one of the surveyed countries, in Turkey, whereby Russia was actually seen as more positive than China. In fact, public opinion in Turkey perceives the US, Russia, and China more or less in the same light. So these general sentiments towards these three powers are mirrored in more concrete issues related to individual countries, like how closely should your country's foreign policy align with the following actors: Russia, China, or the US? So we can see the Turkish public, for instance, prefer their country's foreign policy to be aligned equally with the US and Russia, and only slightly less so for China. For Greece, there is a more visible preferences to the alignment with the US, although we can be seen that the public is also relatively open towards their foreign policy's alignment with Russia and China. So next, when asked who is to blame for the Russia-Ukraine war, the most blamed actor was Russia. However, respondents in Turkey, Greece, and the US actually were less sure about that compared to the other countries. So in fact, the Greek public also blamed Ukraine for the war, while the public in Turkey, Romania, and Belgium also put part of the blame on Ukraine. So moreover, in Greece and Turkey, the US was blamed even more strongly than Ukraine for the war. In Romania, the US and Ukraine were blamed equally, and a substantial number of Czechs also put the blame of the war on US. So this is in line with the findings from the general sentiments in the previous slide, and is indeed worrying for the cohesion of the alliance facing Russian aggression in Ukraine. So the data gives some hints about the question of whether there are some potential synergies between Russia and Chinese info ops, although it does seem so, at least on the level of audience attitudes. A series of regressive analysis on the driving forces behind some of these key statements were also done in this research, and it was found that, for instance, the willingness to blame the US for the Russian-Ukraine war increased among respondents who were more positive in general about Russia and China. So in other words, with a positive attitude towards Russia, this is a strong predictor of willingness to blame US. And a positive attitude towards China further increases the likelihood that a respondent would blame the US for the war. So some further variables with a statistical significance predicting strength were social class, education level, urban-rural divide, and being culturally open or close to changes. So what can be gleaned with the qualitative, anecdotal, and qualitative data presented here today? So the key finding is that the strategic convergence of China and Russia to some degree is mirrored in the convergence of their info operations. The main driving force seems to be the increased overlap between some of their goals in their info operations. So though at the same time it is important not to overstate the degree of convergence or extrapolate this trend deterministically into the future. Russia seems to also to be using a much broader spectrum of tactics and channels to approach different ideological groups in the West. So primarily, these two actors share their same anti-US positions as well. Though another factor that might contribute to the convergence in their info operation influence is the shared audience that they have in NATO countries. So the results of the survey conducted in this research not only point to important differences between the vulnerabilities between individual NATO member states, but also a strong correlation in the openness towards Chinese and Russian narratives in some of the member states. The result of the survey highlight that openness towards Chinese and Russian narratives often go hand in hand, and therefore the normative affinity towards their messaging exists also at the level of the audience. So in terms of what recommendations can be seen from this research, although there is so far limited data that would clearly identify learning patterns, and there is little that NATO can do directly to prevent it, NATO should be prepared for the potential Chinese expansion of the disruptive tactics and narratives that can be modeled in the example of Russia. So NATO should also make sure that any future response do not automatically fall into the thinking that Russia and China share the same goals and tactics, because they do not. Instead, NATO analysts should be mindful of their differences. These are especially present in the domain of goals behind their info operations. So the survey data also illustrates the differences between the relative vulnerability of individual alliance members in NATO, as well as within the societies of some of the alliance's members. Together with consensus-based decision-making, clearly calls for enhancement of the monitoring and detection capabilities in languages of these member states, as well as focus on vulnerable parts of the alliance, whether states or certain social groups are needed as well. The convergence in openness to Russian and Chinese narratives actually suggests wider dissatisfaction with Western policies in some of the societies and some of the NATO countries. And while there is little that NATO as a military alliance can do to address these long-standing social grievances, it should bear in mind and be mindful of these vulnerabilities while developing its own information campaigns. So with that, I would like to thank you all for listening, and I would like to open the floor to any questions that the audience might have. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Zeng Yukai. Before we go to coffee break, do we have any questions? A fascinating presentation. Sir, on the side of the room.
Thank you for your presentation.
Thank you.
I was wondering, what is the level of maturity of China's informant influence operations on social media by using, for example, soft puppet accounts and so on, and what are the lessons learned from Russia's previous operation of this kind? Thank you.
Thank you. So to address the first part of your question, definitely not as developed as Russia in this space. We do not see a lot of covert operations, especially nowhere near the extent that Russia does, especially in the information space in the European or NATO countries. What they seem to do is to rely more on agreements with large media companies, which one of the points that we actually highlighted is that audiences in Europe, NATO, and the US sometimes do not realize that they are consuming content that were being churned out by the Chinese media because they are being hosted through agreements on some of these larger networks and TV and news outlets. So, but to your second point of the question, I think China is they have some cooperation in terms of process of convergence. Observing what Russia has done could be passive cooperation, whereby passive learning, whereby they actually are looking at what Russia has been doing, what has been successful, what has been not. There's wealth of information, and continue to have. There's continued data on this that China could be using and is probably using to learn from Russia in this sense. So to summarize, though I think they are currently definitely not as advanced in this area, especially in the covert operations, it would not be wise to think that they will not eventually catch up or accelerate their learnings in this area based on this conflict as well.
Thank you. Excellent. I saw lots of hands up, so let's take a couple more. Maybe in the front here.
Right.
Thank you for your presentation.
Thank you.
Exhaustive presentation. I guess it was around February 8th when Putin visited Xi in Beijing, and they declared their forever friendship. Now, looking at it from China's point of view, at a strategic level, compared to the pre-invasion and after invasion, could you tell me the gains that China has made in the West and the gains that they have probably made vis-a-vis China? My own sense is that China has gained the most in Russia in terms of cheap energy and perhaps making Russia a junior partner. In the West, I'm not sure what they've really gained in terms of economics, politics, international relations, but I'd like to have your points of view. Thank you.
All right, thank you. So we do see that there is probably a shift in the relation, first of all, between Russia and China, especially general increasing asymmetry between the relationships, especially during this war. With regard to China, the view on China in Europe and in NATO countries, I think I do agree with you that the perceptions, perhaps they have not gained as much as we would think they have in some of the European and EU countries, simply because many of the countries, especially in the alliance, are a little bit wary about Chinese influence, especially since the Russian-Ukraine war, and they see what a hostile state like Russia can do in this instance. So because of the similarities between both countries, both are autocratic in terms of their human rights records, countries do see similarities, at least some similarities between these two countries. So they are not about to run away from Russia into the arms of China in this sense, especially in the European and NATO countries. Having said that, I think, right, so although they have not benefited from this, the Russian war, in terms of perceived social standing in Europe and the other countries, we might see a shift in their strategies as we move forward as well. In terms, we've recently seen a reshuffling in their foreign ministries, in their ambassadors, and a softer tone, especially in recent weeks. So we would see whether they are moving away from some of the tougher rhetoric that they have been churning out. Yeah, so that would be my take on how the European countries, whether they have benefited, especially in the domain of the info space, in Europe for China. Yeah. Thank you.
Excellent. I think one more question for sure. Sir in the middle, yeah.
Thank you very much. I have two very
you
short...
could introduce yourself.
Sorry, Whit Mason, and one part of my introduction actually refers to my question, which is that a long time ago I lived in Vladivostok, Russia, and was very struck by the level of anti-Chinese racism that I found. And one question is what role do you think that racism will play in limiting the closeness of the relationship between China and Russia on both sides? And another question is just about the China Daily, which I often see being distributed in very prominent locations alongside the Financial Times and the New York Times, which is rather striking. That, first of all, that it's allowed to happen, the distributors are happy to do it. And I wonder what place in the Chinese information efforts, operations, the China Daily plays. Thank you.
All right, to answer the first part of your question, I think in terms of international cooperation and relations, probably racism, although it exists, would probably not play a big role because these are autocratic regimes. So they are from the top down. They approach from the top down. Any agreements and anything that flows from there stems from cooperation between autocratic regimes. So at this stage, like, if the governments say, yes, we are going to cooperate at this level, eventually the issue of racism might come in towards the later part of the process, which I think they might address. And to be frank, I think it might cause some issues towards the later part of the process, but at least I don't, or we don't see that happening at the top level of cooperation between the two countries. In the second part of your question, I think it really ties in with what China has been using as a strategy in their info operations, and not only in their info operations, but their relationships with other countries and worldwide economically in general, which is they use very gray area kind of tactics, whereby you have things like, you have a legitimate news outlet. There is no different from some of the other Western news outlets. Sometimes in terms of bias fact-checking, the content that they actually produce, the quality of their articles. So these are legitimate, they roll out legitimate products. And if society sought to ban them, or sort of discredit them, or leave them out from certain contracts or projects or countries, then the issue comes whereby, why are we doing this? Because these are legitimate products. Are you trying to curb like free trade? Are you trying to, they can very easily make this a nationalistic issue as well. Yeah. So this is something that I think the COE is trying to look at as well with regard to gray area tactics, particularly in the information domain from China as well. Yep.
Okay. Maybe one last question, because there's such interest in the sir in the grey suit.
Thank you. Joe Morley-Davies. I'm from Albany Associates, private sector. I was wondering if you'd seen any observable trends in kind of presentation styles of content. Did both use imagery and text in kind of an equal manner, or was there a preference by either Russia or China for so-called meme fare over the other? Thank you.
So based on my limited observation in terms of memes, for particularly for both countries, it seems that the Russian info ops users makes use of memes more effectively than the Chinese do. Yeah, but of course, this is not to say that the Chinese won't eventually catch on or catch up in this area and in this aspect as well, because the covert tactics employed by the Russians are ahead by those employed by the Chinese. I would say especially true in content produced in particular countries in their own languages as well. So the Chinese have really yet to catch up on this compared to the Russians as well.
Okay, excellent. Thank you so much for the
Thank you.
insightful answers.